Okay, so we're going to talk about democracy in America, quote unquote, suffrage expansion, Indian removal, and slavery. We're looking at this pretty fairly short period, but it's an important period from 1808 to 1820, really from 1808 to like the 1830s. We're going to look at what's going on in the United States, this fairly new country. So, not long after the writing of the Constitution, again, less than 30 years, once again, the United States finds itself at war with Great Britain. During the War of 1812 basically began over a series of conflicts between these two parties. The United States, again, all about free trade, all about selling their stuff to whoever wants to buy it. They're openly selling all sorts of materials to Napoleon, who is actively waging war in Europe against Great Britain and the European nations. During this conflict, the Great Britain seizes hundreds of U.S. ships, basically on the high seas. Again, because they are, engaging in trade with the French. One of the things they do, as well as take the ships and their cargo, is also take the men. They took approximately 6,000 United States citizens and basically forced them into the British Navy. British Navy had a real difficult time getting people to join. They engage in all sorts of nefarious tactics to get people to join the Navy. This was one of them. It was called impressment. They basically forced them into the Navy. The United States over and over again protests this type of behavior. Also, the United States cites British naval aggression, opening fire on American ships in particular. So this war lasts about 2.5 years. The United States attempts another grand project of expansion north, invading Canada, and at one point burning York, which is modern-day Toronto, to the ground. It's an unsuccessful attempt, as the Canadians actually actively resist this invasion and do not want to become part of the United States. Now, one of the phenomenon of the War of 1812 was the use of African troops or black troops. Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane issues a proclamation in 1814, basically calling on enslaved Africans in the Americas to flee their plantations and join the colonial Marines. About 4,000 respond. The colonial Marines were an all-black fighting force that really inspired great terror amongst especially white slave owners. At one point, they are able to successfully attack Washington, D.C. and burn it to the ground. Now, the British knew the fear that these soldiers inspired in the hearts of the Americans, and they used that. But they were so loathed by Americans, by white plantation owners in particular, they were immortalized in the nation's national anthem. Again, Francis Scott Key was a slave owner. He wrote the Star Spangled Banner, and in it he talks about this is during this period of heightened patriotism. It's one of the stanzas of the national anthem that you probably have never heard sung because it's part this one. It's like the third stanza. But again, black troops are demonized, and this must be seen within the context of, these African men, enslaved Africans, of course, they're going to fight for the side that offers them freedom. And we saw the same phenomenon during the Revolutionary War. But here he talks about the hireling and slave. No refuge could save them from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave, right? This is in direct reference to these black troops. Many of these black troops, they fought. They if they survived and got their freedom, they were resettled in Trinidad, where a lot of their descendants are. However, at the Battle of New Orleans, which is a major turning point in the war, right? Um, African American troops fought on the side of the United States, right? Andrew Jackson becomes a war hero as the man responsible for this victory. And also after the victory, he engages and again, he's a real fan of expansion via the expulsion of the Mississippi Valley of all the indigenous people in their territories. And again, it followed the typical pattern of destroying villages, massacring folks, and that sort of thing. This is when the United States expands into what is now Indiana and Michigan. The War of 1812 is often called the Second War of Independence. U.S. nationalism flourishes ideologically. the national anthem is written to kind of celebrate this triumph. The war ends with the Treaty of Ghent, which basically acknowledges a stalemate. The United States expands, yeah, into territory that they already had, but they failed to expand northward, and that's what they really wanted to do. Andrew Jackson, as I said, becomes a hero, and the period later on, from the 1820s through to the 30s, is going to be referred to as the kind of the Jacksonian period, and his novel idea about republicanism is going to be referred to as Jacksonian democracy. Now, during the War of 1812, something goes on. An uprising, a pan-indigenous movement led by an indigenous leader by the name of Tecumseh or Tecumseh. Anglo-American expansion had continued at a fevered pitch since the end of the Revolutionary War, and after 1812, even more so. A lot of things going on. Alcohol, which had been sold on the frontier for generations. A lot of the indigenous people are recognizing, particularly Tecumseh, that it's destroying their societies. Tenskwatawa, a prophet, he was a prophet amongst the indigenous people, teams up with Tecumseh, and he has this spiritual vision and leaves alcohol. And he begins to preach the spiritual message of renewal, telling the indigenous people to, quote, leave the ways of the white man, unquote, and prosperity would remain, would return to them, excuse me. They even build a town, Prophet Town, right? And they have it's a huge settlement that later is going to be destroyed by the United States. But this is kind of this pan-indigenous movement where, you have several different nations coming together, kind of recognizing, similar to what Pontiac tried to do, that their common enemy was European and now United States Anglo-American expansion into their territory. Prophetstown is destroyed in 1811. From 1811 to 1813, again, this is when Tecumseh is waging his war against the United States. He allies with the British in 1812, but he's killed in 1813, and Tenskwatawa is exiled to Canada. But again, what's important about this is you have this another instance, and you'll see this later on in the late 19th century, where indigenous people are going to recognize that the conflicts between them pale in comparison to the threat that they face at the hands of Anglo-American expansion. So democracy in America. So basically, this is basically the removal of property qualifications for voting in most states by 1840. The French diplomat Alexandre de Tocqueville finds this new republic. He comes to the United States to visit and wants to observe and write about this new republic and finds it a fascinating curiosity, as he described it. What's novel about the United States in this period is about 90% of white males could vote. So this is the mass enfranchisement of white males during the Jacksonian period. Alexander de Tocqueville was fascinated by this, and he's fascinated by how United States citizens practice democracy. He called it more than just voting. He called it a, quote, culture of habit, unquote, or a habit of the heart was another quote that he had. That includes activism, participation in civic organizations, actively acting to exercise power, even on a micro level, like electing the dog catcher. And the idea of, sovereignty belonging to the masses. He found this quite revolutionary, quite progressive, and quite appealing. There's also at this period a kind of information revolution taking place, and this expands the political sphere into the masses. Steam-powered printing presses became quite common, which resulted in a reduction in the cost of printing. So more pamphlets, more books, more newspapers. The literacy rate in the United States was one of the highest in the Western world, probably the highest, even though it's probably only about 65%. It's still the highest in all of the Western countries. A lot of the papers, you have many more newspapers and periodicals in circulation as a result of increased literacy. And they begin to kind of embrace a sensationalist kind of coverage of politics, often politics as entertainment. But again, the common people exercising political power is kind of the result of this technological advance in the dissemination of information. Now, Jacksonian democracy. So American nationalism emerges after 1820, but not as an explicit ideology, rather the shared feeling of kind of this imagined community. It's kind of this shared sense of an entirely new country, unique in social, economic, and spatial openness, right? And also embracing the notion that the United States was a sacred secular project. The overall result was a dynamic capitalist orientation focused actually on westward expansion. This drives the Jackson Victory of 1828, which is recognized as an expansion of democracy whilst also at the same time solidifying the notion of whiteness as the norm and white nationalism, right? As the foundation of American citizenship. So even as, right, um, more white men get the vote, expansion into territories and the expulsion of native indigenous people is taking place on a large scale, and slavery is also expanding. The plantocracy, the plantation class is becoming more powerful. Blacks are being more and more marginalized, free and enslaved, right? So an example would be the Indian Removal Act of 1830. President Jackson rejected any suggestion that the indigenous people could be assimilated. He wanted all of them expelled to west of the Mississippi River. This was his project, right? To remove these people, make this land available for white settlement, kind of what we now call ethnic cleansing. Now, particularly in the southern areas, you have the so-called five civilized tribes, right? And those were the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and the Seminole, right? And these tribes had tried to assimilate. A lot of them had adapted many of the ways of Anglo-Americans. Many of them, especially the Cherokee, had enslaved people and had plantations. And they did this in the hope. They mimicked Anglo-American behavior, adopted Christianity, etc., believing that they could then become part of this republic. But again, Jackson was very firmly on this notion that they did not belong, that this was a republic of white men. So these five civilized tribes, so-called civilized tribes, are going to be expelled. So later, after Jackson's territory, the Trail of Tears takes place from approximately 1838 to 1839. This is the mass expulsion, which again is a result of Jacksonian policy, but it's carried out under President Van Buren. Approximately 18,000 Cherokee are forced to basically do a long trek, often by foot or by horse or by wagon, from the southeast out to what is now the state of Oklahoma. So this is the forcible removal of the Cherokee resulted in about 25% of them dying on this trip. It's called the Trail of Tears. After this, three of the five civilized tribes, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Creek, agreed to move. Federal government pressure and threats, and after they saw what happened to the Cherokee, kind of motivates them to do this. The Seminoles, however, are going to resist. The Seminoles are in Florida, and Florida, for many hundreds of years, dating back to the Spanish period, had been a refuge for enslaved Africans when they ran away. Again, from going all the way back to the late 17th and early 18th century, Spain had a policy of giving freedom to any enslaved African who made it to Florida, and then they would arm them. They would give them rifles. And the idea was to use these people to check expansion into Spanish territory. They weren't necessarily abolitionists. This was a very cold, pragmatic practice, right? But what happened was that enslaved Africans who would come to Florida would actually mix in with the Seminole community. And so they become like a united front against expansion of the British, and later on, of course, the Americans. In 1821, Spain ceded Florida to the United States, and free blacks, along with the Seminole and blacks who had actually become part of the Seminole Nation, resist this. They refused to leave their land. From 1835 to 1842, they fight a pretty pitched war using surprise attacks and using the pretty intense terrain of Florida. to fight back against U.S. Soldiers. They never actually they're never necessarily defeated. They never surrender, but they do lose control of Florida. Obviously, they lose territorial control of Florida. This is an illustration of a Seminole interpreter. He was with the Seminole people. He could speak English and Seminole, and he would translate for military and political authorities. His name was Abraham, and it's the pictures of the Negro Abraham because it became apparent that he was of African descent. So in Jacksonian democracy, it becomes very much a white man's republic. Africans, whether they're free or enslaved, are barred from voting in almost all of the states, especially in the South, and they're increasingly restricted in the northern states as well. The Democratic Party is formed from Jacksonians who are pro-slavery, pro-expansion, and pro-Indian removal. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 is the beginning of a series of compromises between the slaveholding states and the northern states, basically to try to check the power of the plantation class, right? So Missouri becomes a slave state. Maine is broken off from Massachusetts and becomes a free state, canceling the other out. The nullification crisis is an attempt by southern states to push back against the federal government authority. The basis for this is not slavery, but it sets the pattern and the foundation for later state opposition to the federal government, which will lead to secession in the 1860, which is the beginning of the Civil War, and we will definitely talk about that. So here's a map of the line. So this line here is the Mason-Dixon line. It goes up here. It separates Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania from Virginia, Kentucky, etc. Right from the slave states. And the idea is that there will be no slavery above that line. But this is going to set the stage for future conflict between slave owning and free states. Enslavers are going to be very much in favor of expansion. Number one, because they want to spread slavery, thus having more pro-slavery politicians in the Senate and in Congress, and also the nature of the plantation economy. It's kind of a necessity to gain access to more and more acres. You need thousands of acres to produce the commodities to make the kind of profit that they want to make. And they're often exhausting the soil and having to move further west to find better soil. A lot of the nations above the 3630 line are going to focus more on industry, and they're going to also begin to fear the power of the plantation class. As the plantation class by 1860s, they're the richest demographic of white men in the world, basically. They're making incredible profits using slave labor. So in conclusion, we looked at the indigenous resistance to expansion, the idea of democracy in America, the kind of the spreading of democracy to all white males. But keep in mind, this is again the enshrining of white supremacy as well as a foundation of the nation. And that's not really going to be challenged until you get the passing of the 14th Amendment in 1868. Again, these pan-indigenous movements are kind of a harbinger of what's to come. As you know, there's various indigenous leaders are going to recognize that the greater threat to all of the indigenous people is westward expansion of Anglo-Americans, right? By 1840, again, removal of property qualifications from in most states creates this white man's republic. But again, with expansion, the question of slavery is going to become an issue, right? And the Missouri Compromise, right, which is designed to address that issue, is just the first of many compromises that are actually going to fail in terms of stopping the United States from getting involved in the bloodiest war of its history, the American Civil War.